Okay, now we're very happy to be joined by our guest today. It's Ken Go, the longtime track and field beat reporter who retired on November 6th after 43 years at the Oregonian. Ken wrote about a variety of sports, but notably college football, but to us he was best known as one of the few remaining track and field beat reporters in a major newspaper in the United States. He covered NCAA championships, U.S. championships, Olympic trials, Olympic games, and anything Oregon related, so the Ducks, Bauman Track Club, and the Oregon Project, RIP, you name it. So Ken, thanks so much for joining us, and tell us, how's retirement treating you?
Yeah, so far so good. My wife and I just got back from 3 days at the Oregon coast where the weather was not Oregon-like. It was sunny, it was warm, the wind wasn't blowing, so it was a delightful 3 days and a sort of a good springboard into this next chapter.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, it's funny. Whenever I go out to Oregon, it's always like May or June, and it's usually pretty nice. So it's kind of weird that, the rest of the year it's more rainy. So I'm glad you guys had that good weather.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been covering track and field for as long as I've been following the sport, as long as I've been involved in the sport. But, how long have you been covering the sport? When did you first start reporting on track and field? How'd you get your start?
Well, I began life at the Oregonian as a high school writer, a preps writer. So I did cover high school track then. That was my first exposure to it. I was not a track participant in high school or college. I didn't particularly relate to the sport. I was more of a baseball guy. So it was all brand new to me. A lot of trial and error, which you can get away with at the high school level. But when they had me start covering the Ducks in the late 80s, my lack of knowledge was really exposed, and I was constantly embarrassed by what I wrote. But over time, and that was sort of hit or miss because the Oregon program went into a period there in the from the late 80s through the early 2000s where it wasn't very relevant locally, maybe a little more nationally. I think in a lot of cases they still competed well nationally, but they didn't host home meets, and so for the most part, so there was no real reason to cover them locally. I mean, we sort of paid attention to them, but it wasn't intense beat coverage, and a lot of that was done by one of my colleagues anyway. So it really wasn't until they went out and brought Vin Lananna in to sort of try to reawaken Tracktown USA that, excuse me, the Oregonian got interested in it again and made me a beat writer. So that's really when I became intensely a track writer usually from somewhere in the indoor season. I didn't always start with the start of the indoor season because there's no indoor track here. There are indoor track teams, but there isn't a facility. And through the spring and sometimes into the summer when there was an Olympic Games. So that's how it went.
And did you enjoy covering track from the first time you started covering it, or did it take you a while to actually enjoy and appreciate the sport?
No, it's scary. If you're a mainstream sports writer and you come in, there's so much specialized knowledge that you have to really write about it knowledgeably, and a lot of things that are counterintuitive to a sports writer that covers ball games, football, basketball, baseball, and I had to learn, and I had to learn a lot of times by making mistakes, and a lot of times it was really embarrassing, and that's when I picked the sport up again in 2005. That's when I discovered Let's Run, and to be honest, you guys helped a lot because we would cover the same thing, and then I would look at what you guys wrote, and I go, oh God, I missed this, and I missed this, I missed this, and so it sort of helped me gain a knowledge of the sport from a technical standpoint.
Well, Ken, I think you're giving us too much credit because I was trying to do the math in my head when I'm like, well, Vin, that's kind of when we started. And I just remember going to meets in Oregon and like meeting you and seeing you. And I'm like, oh, this guy knows what he's doing. Maybe you helped us with the Oregon scene. And I don't know. First of all, I want to kind of jump in and thank you for all you've done for the years. And you were a good guy. Like you were helpful to us, anything we needed with Oregon and that sort of stuff. So I'm glad our articles could help in some way with you because it's interesting to hear you talk like, oh, I really messed up. And I'm like, what? No, this guy knows track and field. Like Ken's a track and field guy. So it's interesting to hear the transformation.
What most appealed to me about the sport were the people, the actual events. When it was a close race or, a close competition in the shot or the long jump or the pole vault or whatever, that was fun. But the actual technical parts of how you throw the shot or how you train to be a good 800-meter runner, that didn't resonate with me as much as the people. And I found track and field athletes and coaches fascinating people. They were tend to be very articulate, very knowledgeable about what they do and why they do it, and very easy to interview. Maybe football players are jaded. They get interviewed so much that it doesn't ever come across as fresh and interesting. And I really rarely had that problem with the track athlete. I love talking to track athletes. People like Nick Simmons, very generous with his time, very interesting in what he said. That I always had to make sure my recorder was going though, because I had no chance of keeping up with Nick Simmons in full flow with notes. I mean, it's just he was so articulate and he spoke so rapidly, and it all made so much sense that that darn recorder better be working.
Yeah, Nick was definitely great to cover. I only got to cover him towards the very end of his career. But is there anyone else that really stands out? Any personalities you really enjoyed talking to, or any stories that stand out?
Well, it'd be more, there'd be more that they don't. Dan Steele, who was a longtime assistant track coach at Oregon and later went on, he was fun to talk to. He was a great interview. English Gardner, who was a sprinter at Oregon, went on, I believe is still running professionally and maybe getting towards near the end of her career, but still competitive at the international level. There's so many. I hate to start throwing them out there because I'll miss somebody. It's easier to say that they were almost all good.
Mm. And you think it's just, they're not covered as much as football players, that they're eager for the spotlight? Is that why you think we have more articulate or more interesting people than maybe football or basketball or something like that?
I think, I don't want this to come across wrong because there are smart football players, but I think on the average, track and field athletes are more reflective, and they're probably intellectually more successful at college and tend to be more articulate. And I don't know why that is. I mean, you guys were both track athletes, so maybe you have a better understanding of why that is. In part, maybe in college, very few track athletes are on full scholarships, so they have to be serious students or that they don't get to compete. That might be part of it. I don't know. I guess maybe distance runners are spending a lot of time out there putting in the miles. You got to think about something, right? So maybe you think about why you're doing what you're doing and how to explain it. I mean, I don't really know, but that's just my experience. It's all anecdotal. I haven't gone out and done IQ tests on people, but it just, in my experience, track and field athletes were much more interesting to talk to over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I remember Alan Abramson, who's an Olympic writer and covered other Olympic sports. He's kind of said the same thing about track athletes. And I can only speak for distance runners, but you're saying it applies to shot putters and everybody else. So I don't know. I think for distance running, and maybe this applies to other sports in track and field, distance running, you're just out there. It's such a grind. You're probably constantly questioning, like, why am I doing this? Whereas like football, there's the team element, there's camaraderie, there's probably parts in practice that are just a lot more fun. And distance running, yeah, maybe there's fun in practice. You're essentially, running next to someone for an hour, hour and a half. On an easy run, that's easy. So you're going to talk about stuff. So then you're thinking. But I don't know. I haven't figured it out. I always wonder, like, why do we run and why are we doing this? But that probably comes out because anyone who's in track and field first didn't get into it for the fame and glory. They might have been good at it, but at some point, it's kind of off the beaten path.
Yeah, I think that's true. Absolutely. And, it's not just distance runners. Adam Nelson was a great interview at shot putter. He was phenomenal to talk to and phenomenal to watch. I mean, he put on a show. I think some track fans don't pay a lot of attention to the shot, but he commanded attention when he was out there.
Probably Dartmouth's greatest ever track and field athlete, I think. And he was also president of his fraternity at Dartmouth. He was all around very fascinating fellow. But I'm interested, you mentioned you really love the people, but I'm sure you also covered a lot of great meets, at the Olympics or at Hayward Field, U.S. Championships trials. What races really stand out to you as sort of favorite ones you got to witness?
The favorite thing I ever covered in my entire career, not just track, but all sports, was the 2008 Olympic trials final in the 800 meters, which I still go back and watch that NBC replay of that and get chills with the way Simmons came out of the back and Wheating behind him. And at the time, I did not notice Christian Smith coming up the inside. I didn't even see him dive at the finish line. And I was just sort of mesmerized by the way that Simmons and Wheating had come out of the back and the way they challenged down the home straight and won, and the crowd reaction, which I don't know that I've, at any sporting event I've ever been at, have I heard a crowd that loud. And then I think I was sitting next to Doug Bender, who now is the editor for Dystat, and he elbowed me and he said, "I think Christian Smith got third place." And then they showed the results up there on the scoreboard, and damned if he didn't. And as an Oregon writer, that probably resonated with me more because all three guys were either from Oregon or represented Oregon. Christian Smith was not from an Oregon college, but he ran for OTC Elite. And Simmons, my gosh, he was a Division III athlete at Willamette, and everybody thought he had a chance to make the team. I don't know how many people thought he was going to win. And Wheating was still running for Oregon, and everybody thought, he's a good athlete, and his sometime in the future he might make it on the international level. I don't know if anybody thought he was going to make the Olympic team. So that was amazing. And then another one, when Ashton Eaton set the world record at the Olympic trials, again, what a moment. And again, the crowd response was incredible. And then the way the other athletes on the track sort of helped him along, which I think is another part that's really cool about track. It's hard as some of those athletes compete against each other. It's an individual sport, and they find a way to separate their own attempt to do their best and still appreciate those around them who are also doing that and may do it a little bit better. And on that day in the decathlon, I think all the other decathletes were pulling for Ashton Eaton to break the world record, and he did. It was crazy.
Yeah, no, those two were crazy races. I remember Curtis Beach, who was like, he was a better middle distance runner than Ashton Eaton, but he sort of pulled aside and let Eaton break the tape to get the world record. It just feels like every Olympic trials, there's like that one race that really stands out, or that one moment. It was that in 2012. It was the 800 in 2008, and I think in 2016 it was probably that men's 5K with Bernard Lagat winning, and that wasn't, I don't think it was quite as historically significant as those other two, but I don't know. That's just like the best meet to go to, I think, as a fan in the United States, is the Olympic trials, and really special.
I agree.
I'm curious, though, what is your press box demeanor? Because I know when I am watching those races from maybe the top of Hayward Field, I can't help, I don't root for athletes, but I can't help and yell, like, if I see Lagat steaming down at the outside with 200 to go, I'll just be like, oh my God, look at Lagat. Or if he holds him off, I'll be like, oh my God, that was crazy. I'll be yelling, not for any one person, but just sort of the race. Do you ever get like that, or are you more chill? What's your demeanor in the press box?
I'm usually trying to make sure that I see what's going on and that I can adequately describe it later. So, I don't recall ever yelling, but just want to make sure I get it right. When I write about it, I want to correctly describe what happened. And to me, that's not just what's happening on the track. It's what's the crowd's doing, especially at Hayward Field, because the fans tend to be really engaged in the competition. So, there's too much going on in my mind to maybe do what the more natural thing, which is to just appreciate what's happening. I'm too focused on what's happening and can I describe it correctly later.
There's one thing I'm curious about. Like, I got into sports journalism. I think most people who do this because we love sports, and I'm always curious, like, if I cover this for 40 years, am I going to get jaded? Am I not going to appreciate that? Do you ever feel like that happened to you in your career, or do you feel like you love sports just as much as when you started covering them?
No, in some ways, I think I did get jaded. My wife doesn't. She's a sports fan. She doesn't like watching sporting events with me because I tend to think, why did this happen? What's the next step? I was just thinking about logically what's happening in the game and not being a fan. I it's hard for me to stand up and cheer. So she's like, oh, look at that great pass. It's a touchdown. And I'll think, well, how did the receiver get free on that play? So it's like, I'm looking at it in a real different way. And I as you mentioned in your opening, I do have covered a lot of college football. I was into that actually before track. I first started covering the Oregon Ducks in 1984, and at various times covered Oregon State and was the Oregonians' roving, what was then the Pac-10 writer, we didn't really have a national writer like maybe the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or the Washington Post does, but I was a regional writer. I went up and down the coast to the Pac-10 games at the time, the top games every week. But I have become jaded about college football a lot. I mean, I still like the players, and I can enjoy the games at the skill level that people play at. But the stuff around the sport, I find very distasteful. The amount of money that's spent on college football, and the fact that a lot of these guys, I think, are being used for their ability by the schools they're at the major college level, and then just sort of discarded after it's over. I mean, to me, the fans and the boosters, their allegiance is essentially to the uniform, not to the individual. And when the individual's gone, they care about him if he goes on in the NFL and has a great career. They like to take credit for that and root for him. But if the guy doesn't make the NFL, he's forgotten. And that guy went out there and put his body on the line on the gridiron for 4+ years and might have come out of it with some sort of disabling injury. And so what? I mean, there's a new team, new players, new reasons to be excited. So yeah, that part has jaded me. I'm less jaded about the track athletes, but it's stuff around the sport. You know, the way it's governed. I find what USA Track and Field does sometimes just incomprehensible. Like that, they're not that interested in making the sport better. It seems to me. I might be missing something, but they're just caught up in the governance of it and you know, sort of maximizing the revenue that they can get out of it. But the athletes sort of get left out, and that bothers me.
Yeah, I think one of the criticisms I've heard, you know, during this pandemic is just USATF. They did hold like a road mile championships in, I think, July or August or something, but really they didn't seem interested in having a national championships. And I get that it's tough, but like you look at the other major sports, well, major sports are finding a way to hold these meets, and USATF, whether it's a money issue or a lack of interest, really hasn't. And most of the coaches are like, well, we don't expect them to anyway, but I don't know. I think it's a bummer for the athletes. Not, you know, it was the first time since like almost Civil War, I think, that there wasn't a national championships in track and field.
Yeah, you know, I get it on one level because the pandemic's serious, and with track, you're bringing people in from all over the country to a single place, and to make it financially feasible, you want to have fans, right? I mean, they're not making enough money on TV contracts to make it pay off that way. So, but I mean, on a local level, I think people did stage track meets. We had some here, the big friendly track meets. There were some in Southern California, I think some in Georgia, some in Michigan, where they found ways to make it safe. And it would have been interesting to see if on a national level, USATF or somebody could have found a way to use those same principles and guidelines that they use to make them safe at the regional level and do something.
Because, I mean, you look Europe, okay, I think during the summer they were probably handling the pandemic better than the United States was, but most of the countries in Europe seem like they found a way to hold national championships, and they're not coming from as far apart as the United States, but, you know, you would think they might be able to figure it out somehow. And it didn't even seem like they were interested in doing that to me. That's what I got out of it. But I want to go back. You mentioned football. You know, you've covered football for a long time as well. And the differences between the athletes. What were the other differences you found in covering the two sports? Like, was it just in terms of media? Was it just there were more people covering football, or are there anything else that really stands out to you?
Yeah, over time, access to college football players has become more and more difficult. College coaches have really limit how much I guess access is the right word that you can have to individual players. And for me, sports has always been about the people participating more than the competitions anyway. And the stories of which I'm most proud that I've done have generally been profile stories, where you get to know somebody and sort of explain about them in a way that makes them resonate with the readers. And I think in football, it's maybe even more important because the public doesn't see those guys. I mean, they're all padded up with helmets and pads. Sometimes when they take off their helmets and you engage them in that way, they become a lot more interesting, at least to me. There was a running back at Oregon several years ago when I was covering the team named LaMichael James, he was a finalist for the Heisman and fairly guarded with the media lots of times. But I had a chance to meet him and sort of get past that. And he's a fascinating guy. And Kenyon Barner, I don't know if he's still in the league, but he was up until last year for sure. Also another just fascinating person. Once you got past the how did you see the whole, what were you thinking when you passed the line of scrimmage? What did that pass look like? Was it well thrown? I mean, you get all the pro forma questions and really get into their lives and what makes them tick. To me, that's interesting.
So I want to ask about a track and field personality who I would say was generally guarded with most members of the public. This is Alberto Salazar. Now, you're one of the few media members, maybe the only one that he would talk to on a semi-regular basis. What was it like covering him?
I went into it pretty guarded, actually, because I had read a lot of what other people have said about him. And when I first started covering him, John Cook had just split with the Oregon Project, and it was pretty acrimonious split. And I was hearing a lot from John Cook about why he didn't like Alberto and how unethical he thought he was. And I arranged to do an interview, a one-on-one with Alberto at the Nike campus. And he sort of disarmed me because he dealt with all those questions head on in a way that seemed open. And so I wrote a story, a profile of Alberto, and he liked the story. He thought I was fair to him, and that probably gave me some cred with him then. He has at times thanked me for having an open mind about him. I don't think a lot of people in the sport do have an open mind about him. I think they have made up their mind from the start that this guy's up to no good. And there is some circumstantial evidence that might lead you to believe that. But I think most of the evidence I've seen, the evidence of which I'm aware, is circumstantial. I know he's been banned, and I know Awada nailed him on several things. I never saw any of those things as particularly heinous. They indicated to me a guy that was trying to stay within the rules while getting as close to the line as he could, that's sort of Alberto. And in a couple cases, it looks like he maybe got over the line a little bit, but I never saw it as Ben Johnson or Marion Jones type cheating. I think the emails he exchanged with USADA during that period show he was trying very carefully to stay within the rules. So I think he liked the fact that I had an open mind about it, and then I hadn't made up my mind that he was guilty.
Well, it's interesting because there are some people, we just read this book, Win at All Costs by Matt Hart. I'm not sure if you've read it yet, but one of the lines in there, he mentioned you, and he said, that you had historically contorted his objectivity, those are his words, in an effort to stay in the Nike men's good graces. I think that sometimes comes up on our message boards too. Someone say, "Oh, you can go. He's too soft on Alberto. He's the only one he talks to." Do you think that criticism is fair?
Well, I want to separate two things to start with. I want to separate Nike and Alberto. I think a lot of the criticisms Alberto takes are actually criticisms of Nike and the way that Nike conducts business, which I think is unfair. Nike is a very difficult organization to cover. For instance, Phil Knight has never consented to an interview request with me. Dealing with Nike PR is an exercise in futility often, because no matter what you ask, they say no. So I reject the criticism that I'm soft on Nike. I think you'd have a hard time finding anything that I've written that would indicate that I was. The question about Alberto, I think, gets down to how you evaluate the evidence. And to me, I've seen very little persuasive evidence that he was a systematic cheater. Now, maybe you can say, well, it depends on how you define cheating. And that might be a fair point. And maybe people are saying, when they criticize me for being soft in Alberto, that I'm not being critical enough of him for being in a gray area or violating the spirit of the rules. I've never understood the spirit of the rule thing anyway. To me, that's a subjective opinion. I mean, who's defining what the spirit of the rule is? That there is a rule, and the rule is black and white, and you either have broken that rule or you haven't. And the spirit of the rule thing gets really iffy, and maybe that's partly from covering other sports. Like if you cover baseball and there's a runner on second base, he's trying to pick off the catcher's signs and relay him to the batter, and that's considered part of the game. I know the Astros this last year sort of stepped over that by using high-tech equipment, and that's where baseball seems to have drawn the line about what's the spirit of the rules, but sign stealing itself is considered part of the fabric of the game. Track seems to be much more strict in defining what's the spirit of the rules, but again, it's an individual interpretation of what that is, and I still am yet to be persuaded that Alberto Salazar did anything other than be a really tough coach who did his utmost to get his athletes to win. And yeah, he probably stepped into a gray area sometimes, and maybe he got too close to the line. But again, not heinous, not Marion Jones, not any of the rampant cheaters that were clearly caught doing something wrong. I haven't seen it.
So that's interesting, because one, the Matt Hart criticism I thought was unfair, because I would see this criticism on Let's Run sometimes with people saying that, oh, Ken's too soft on Nike, too soft on Alberto. And I thought that was an interesting distinction you made. And I'm like, well, one, Ken's talking to Alberto. He's talking to Galen Rupp. You're going to present their side of the story.
I get the fact that people think I was too soft on Alberto. And I tend to view that as more I have an open mind, and present me with the evidence that he was a blackguard and a cheater. And I'll say, okay, I agree. I'll criticize him too. I have not seen that evidence. I've seen a lot of smoke. I've seen very little fire. I will say the stuff with Mary Kane was disturbing. I remember Mary Kane when she first burst onto the scene, and how delightful a young athlete was, and how full of promise and life and joy she seemed to be, and how her joy in the sport was infectious. I used to like to watch her post-race interviews, because she was just such a happy person, and she just was so enthusiastic about what she was doing. And whatever happened here with the Oregon Project clearly took that away from her. Now, where I'm not sure is how much of that can be pinned strictly on Alberto. I think he probably wishes he had now in retrospect, that he had a woman assistant coach who could have maybe helped him deal with things that are specific to women runners, and especially young women runners, he had not had young women runners before. He had older ones, but never a young woman. And I think maybe if the Canes were to look at this in retrospect too, they would question their decision to decide to send Mary out here at that age. I'm not defending anything that that happened between Alberto and Mary Kane. I'm just, the whole thing was disturbing, and I feel really bad that happened to her, and that she lost that joy and enthusiasm for the sport.
Yeah, I think Alberto's critics, I think they would also say, well, it wasn't just Mary, because Amy Yoder Begley has come out saying she was fat shamed, and Cara Goucher. I mean, Cara Goucher, they got along really well, and then that ended badly, obviously, as well. But I'm curious, about the Salazar and Rupp. I mean, those two had such a close relationship for so many years. He's been coaching Galen since he was in high school, and then suddenly, in the middle of World Championships last year, Alberto is banned, and he's not allowed to coach him at all. And he basically can't, you can maybe say, hey, I can't coach him anymore. What do you think their relationship is like now? Do you think it's totally severed? Do you think they still talk as friends? And how do you think it's been on both of them just not being able to have this coach-athlete relationship that they had for almost 2 decades?
Yeah, I want to start by saying I don't really know. I mean, I haven't talked to Alberto since the ban. I think on the advice of his lawyers, he's really limiting who he talks to and what he says. So I don't know if they talk, but I think they were moving a little apart anyway, even before this happened. I think as Galen matured and got older, he had his own ideas about what he wanted to do. Early in his career, Alberto basically controlled everything. And I don't think Galen saw a reason not to have it that way because he was successful. But I think as Galen matured and went from a high school athlete to a man, I think he started to have his own ideas about what he wanted to do, and he didn't want to be controlled that way anymore. So I think, and to Alberto's credit, I think he understood that too, and let up on the reins a little bit, and Galen began having more of a say in what he did and how he did it. So when the break came, I don't think it was as shocking as it might have been otherwise. And I think that's clear that, Galen was ready to go his own way. He could have joined Pete Julian's training group, which was where a lot of the Oregon Project runners went after the split. Had he wanted to continue with Alberto's philosophy. Now, I'm not saying Pete's a carbon copy of Alberto, because he's clearly not. He's his own man, and he trains people his own way. But if Galen had wanted to stay connected, however you define that, to where he had been in the past, that would have been the natural move. Instead, he went outside. And I think that's just because he has more confidence in himself and more of an understanding of what he wants outside of Alberto. So I think that was going to happen anyway to some extent.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, because Alberto is he's appealing his ban to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. They're supposed to hear it in March. If they overturn it, do you think Galen would go back to Alberto, or do you think he would stick with Mike Smith? Yeah,
I don't know. That's a good question. I suspect they would get together to an extent, but I also think Alberto had let up a little bit on like I say, on how he was coaching Galen, and Galen had much more of a say in how he did things towards the end of his time with Alberto than he had at the beginning. So even if they got back together, it wouldn't be Alberto just in total control of Galen. It would be Galen would be the primary person in charge of Galen, and he would accept coaching, maybe from Smith, maybe from Alberto. I don't know. They're pretty, as you say, they were pretty close. And Galen's dad even said he saw Alberto as sort of a second father to Galen. And part of that isn't running. Part of that's their religion. They're both conservative Catholics, and they have a very similar religious philosophy and orientation. And I think that'll continue until one of them dies. I mean, that part of their relationship will always be close. But I think Alberto is being very careful not to violate the terms of his probation or his ban, because as you say, he has an appeal coming up, and I think he wants to win that appeal, and he doesn't want to do anything that would jeopardize that.
Well, it's interesting that you said Galen was starting to separate a little bit from Alberto, or just get a little more independence, because I didn't notice that, from afar, but I think it was happening, and it just shows sort of the insight you get there from being closer to them. Because now I see Galen doing interviews and stuff, and It's like, wait, this is what you should do. Like, the press isn't your enemy, but if you never speak to them, like, you'd probably know this better than us. Reporters want quotes, they want access, and you don't get it. We're human beings, right? Like, you still try to be fair, but it's like, well, are they trying to hide something? What's going on? So it's good to see Galen gets outside of his shell.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think Galen is a pretty good guy, really. I also think he's shy and reserved. And I think when he spoke to most reporters to sessions in the mix zone, he tended to get a certain sort of question, right? I mean, if that's the only time people can talk to him, then that's when they're going to ask their tough questions, which maybe isn't the best time for either the reporter or the athlete. And it made him get more guarded still. And I think it is good that he's opening up, and you get to see this guy is smart. You know, he was a 4-point+ student at Oregon in business. He's got a wife and he's got a family. He cares about other people. I mean, he's not this automaton that I think he often got portrayed, and partly because of the way he and Alberto handled that period when everybody at the Oregon Project was so suspicious of most of the running media.
Yeah, I mean, in my interactions with him, I've interviewed Galen probably a dozen times at this point, and I think every single time it just seems like he's had the walls up, and I don't think I've ever gotten to know the real Galen Rupp, because just when he's talking to me, it's in a mixed zone or it's a press conference, and he's not going to open up to me that way.
Well, you know, that's, to be honest, I think that's a point where your message boards get in the way too, because I would always defend you guys when people would comment to me back when, for a long time, the Oregonian allowed comments in our stories, and I used to like to interact with the readers in those comments because I think you could disarm some of the ones that were really vitriolic if you just engaged with them, and you could see that you were a person and they were a person, and yeah, you may not agree with everything, but both of you come about how you believe honestly. But your comment sections can be very brutal to the Oregon Project, to Alberto, and to Galen. And I always draw a line there. I mean, I don't see Let's Run as the worst of the comment section. To me, Let's Run is Jonathan Galt's analysis of a race, or what the week that was, which that's one of my favorite things to read every week because it's a great synopsis of the week in the sport, and most of the comments are really well taken, and it's a really nice survey. To me, that's Let's Run, but I stay off the message boards because the things you see there, whether they're about me or they're about somebody else, are just a lot of times poisonous, and to me there's too much going on in my life, and there's too many other stresses to get into that. So
yeah. No, I mean, I think that's certainly like a fair criticism with some of the stuff towards Galen, especially when he was young, like, late high school, early college years. And Weldon can probably speak more to this, but I think we admit, he got some rough treatment on there. I don't think it was fair for any teenager to experience it. And
not just him, all sorts of runners, even people that are the nicest people in the world, and the people who are open with the press, for whatever reason, there exists in the cyber world these people that just like to throw darts at other people, and we had them in the Oregonian message boards too, which is why the Oregonian did away with them.
Yeah, Ken, you're touching on a few things. I mean, John's not responsible for the message board comments. I mean, that falls on me more so, and there's just a couple interesting things I want to comment on. First, yeah, Galen used to just, I mean, people talk about, it's interesting because you also mentioned Mary Kane earlier. Galen probably got it just as bad as Mary Kane, but like there's this whole sex angle on top of it. He's a man. People comment on his body. I mean, Galen Rupp, if you're listening right now, like, I owe you an apology. I mean, I had Alberto and Vin Lanana both take me aside at the 2008 NCAA championships and rip into me, like, you have to do a better job. And I'm like, it's a public forum. And like, we went in that night and put in filters. Like, you couldn't post Rupp and the word gay at the same time because people would make this homophobic slur. And I'm like, well, so essentially you couldn't talk about Tyson Gay and Galen Rupp at the same time anymore just because they had a point. Like, you got to stop this. But some of the we'll get we'll get an email. Someone will fire off an email just like cussing us out. And then, like you said in the comments, you comment back like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. And they're like, oh, I didn't mean it. Like, you're a real person? Like, we lose our humanity on some of these forums and this sort of stuff. And I love forums in general, but the bad side of them, we're constantly trying to improve it. But
yeah, and I don't want to say not every commenter does that. Obviously, but those are the ones you remember, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You can read 64 comments, but the one that's saying Ken Go is a kiss ass to Alberto Salazar, that's the one I remember.
Yeah, shame on those people. But I think it's also interesting because, like in the comments or how they view Alberto in general, they want it to be black and white, like terrible or great. But I mean, Alberto probably knows this on his outlook on the world. Like, he's a Christian guy. Like, we're all sinners. We're all flawed. Maybe not to the same extent. And that's where I come back to this Matt Hart sort of criticism, or this Kingo kissed up to Nike. Like, one, you said there's a distinction between Nike and Alberto. And if you're having access to those guys, you're going to present their story, their quotes. So some people may not want to hear that to begin with. Like, it's part of doing your job. I always found you to be fair. I'm like, and we still don't know. Like, Alberto in some ways is my arch nemesis after all these years. I have no proof that he doped any athletes. None. I'm more suspicious probably of someone like Mary Slaney. Maybe she was doing that on her own. But my best bet is that he rubbed some testosterone cream on Galen secretly, because I think he should be banned from the sport. I think he broke the rules. I don't know if you'd agree with that. Like, the testosterone experiment, I think technically violates the USADA rules, but we still don't know what happened at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, the point of the USADA rules seemed to me to be to keep athletes from cheating, right? I mean, that's the goal. You want to punish cheaters. And as you say, there's no evidence that's been presented that any of his athletes cheated. And rubbing a little bit of testosterone cream on Alex Salazar is not doping an athlete. I mean, I know Alex was a pretty good high school athlete. I believe he played football a little bit at Oregon too. But when that happened, he was not a competitive athlete. And when Steve Magnus did that test and again, it gets into what's a competitive athlete. I guess he was still running road races or whatever. But he wasn't doping an athlete. And so we get into what was his motivation for doing these things. And then that's subjective, right? He was doing this because he wanted to cheat, or he was doing this because he was running an independent, or whatever motivation he had for doing it. He wasn't doping an athlete. And my view of what USADA did was they, like many others in the running community, are convinced he's been cheating systematically for years and getting away with it. And I've written this, it was sort of like Al Capone, right? They knew Al Capone was breaking laws, but what did they nail him for was tax evasion, right? Because it wasn't killing other people or bootlegging or running a numbers racket on the Chicago South Side or whatever. It was for tax evasion. And here USADA got Alberto for something, but it certainly wasn't what we were led to believe that they were investigating him for, or any of the sensational allegations that were made against him.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, some people will just either you're banned or you're not, and that's all they need. But for myself, it's like, it's not the best ending.
It's like Robert. I mean, anytime Robert's on the podcast, he's always like he was clamoring for him to be banned for years, and then it actually comes out, he's like, I'm not satisfied with this outcome. So now he complains that he is banned. And
well, I thought you guys were very fair in what you wrote about the ban too. I forget exactly what you said, but I think it's along the lines of what I said about him operating in the gray area too much, and you get too close to the line, sometimes you step over it. And again, that's how I view what happened. But I don't see anything heinous in terms of doping Galen up to the gills or having him high on EPO or whatever, and when he won races. To me, there's no evidence of that.
Yeah, I'd be shocked if Alberto was supplying them EPO or anything like that. But I do think, look, I mean, he didn't just break one rule, he broke three, and you can argue whether he stepped over the line by a lot or just a little. To me, I don't have a lot of sympathy for him, but CAS is going to make that decision. They're going to reevaluate the whole thing. So anyway, enough on Alberto. We talked plenty about him. I'm curious about, like, the future track and field journalists. I mean, the Oregonian they're one of the few papers nationwide that actually employs a track and field correspondent. And granted, you didn't cover the sport the whole year round, and probably wouldn't make sense for a newspaper to have that, but because you had college football, there's other sports. But is someone going to be replacing you at the Oregonian? Will they still have a track and field correspondent moving forward?
No, I don't suspect they will. One of the problems with newspaper journalism is dwindling staff sizes and dwindling resources. When I started doing this, our staff was probably twice the size, maybe even more than twice the size it is now. It makes less and less sense for us to cover the sport on a regular basis for several reasons. One, like I say, the resources can probably be spent better in other ways in terms of the readership we get, at least locally. I think what I was able to do was expand beyond local readership. So I think people, based on emails I was getting, were reading my track coverage around the country and in some cases around the world. But I don't know how that pencils out economically for the Oregonian, really. So I would suspect they won't. I think for a while, hopefully through 2022, they will continue to use me on a freelance basis for when the big events come and in the period leading up to that. But the University of Oregon itself has become more difficult to cover. I think when Vin Lananna came in, he saw a real need and a reason for them to be cooperative with the local media, and he basically threw the doors open to me and to Curtis Anderson, who was at that time the Register Guardian's beat writer, and we had pretty good unfettered access, which was great. And the other thing he did was he had home meets. He saw a big believer in trying to reestablish Eugene as Tracktown USA, and they would have as many as 5 home meets during the college track season. I don't know of any other. There might be some, but I'm not aware of other track programs that have that many home meets. At least ones who are at Oregon's level. So there was a lot to write about. It's become more difficult now. Robert Johnson, not the Robert Johnson from Let's Run, but Oregon's track coach is, I think, a very good coach. But he sees less need for the media. Under his direction, they've taken a very defensible decision to send their athletes to where they'll get the best competition, which means often not as many home meets. And he's much more, he runs his program much more like a lot of college football coaches now, major college football coaches, where the media access is restricted. He hasn't done away with it. We can still talk to athletes, but it's much more difficult than it was when Lananna was the coach. So there's probably less reason for us to cover track on a day in, day out basis the way I did.
Well, you mentioned Vin, and we hadn't mentioned it on the podcast, but being in Oregon, sort of Vin, Alberto, Phil Knight, I think those are probably 3 of the biggest people in track and field, but there's this relationship, I assume, between Vin and Phil, and I don't know if you have any insight on that, but Vin, and from an outsider's 30,000 foot perspective, is sort of the one guy getting things done in track and field in America, or at least he was. Do you think, obviously he needed Nike's resources, but do you have any insight into his relationship with Phil? And was Vin driving that and Phil was on board with it, or it's a mutual thing, you think? And now that Vin's gone, do you think he can continue these things outside in Virginia, or is there a rift there between Nike? I mean, I have no idea. I'm just sort of spitballing here.
Yeah, when Vin first came in, he was Nike's guy. I mean, they wanted to resurrect the University of Oregon as a track and field power, and also a team that drew fans. To me, that was very important. They wanted the University of Oregon to also be a distance program. Under Martin Smith, the previous coach, who was technically a very good coach, distances had not been as emphasized as Nike liked. I actually think Alberto Salazar was a pretty key guy in this too. And I think Phil and Alberto engineered Martin Smith's dismissal. They found a good place for him to land at Oklahoma and sort of got him out of the way. And then went out and tried to find somebody they thought could do all these things. Bring back the distances, bring back the track program at Oregon in a way that energized the home crowd and host big meets. And they targeted Lanana. I think Lanana was very happy where he was. He was an administrator at Oberlin. He was tired of, at that point in his life, of the day-to-day grind of coaching. He wanted to get into administration. And so he'd found a good landing spot, and they went out and got him. I remember it was clear they were targeting him from the start, and they refused to say this. And so I went out and deliberately tried to find other track coaches that met those lists of qualifications, which had clearly been tailored just for Lanana. And I remember if you read the letter of the qualifications, Brooks Johnson fit those qualifications. So I started throwing out names of other people like Brooks Johnson who would fit those qualifications just to force them to deal with that. And on top of that, Oregon has a law here that requires college head coaching searches to at least interview one minority candidate. So they had to interview somebody like Brooks Johnson. So maybe I helped them by locating him and saying he met the criteria. But it was clear they were going to hire Lanana from the start, and it's also clear in retrospect he was the right guy because he had the vision to provide what Nike wanted. Now it's expensive what he did, and Nike was putting up the money, still is putting up the money, or if not Nike, Phil Knight from his personal funds, and that's an important distinction. Sometimes I think people conflate the two. Knight's been retired from day-to-day running of Nike for a while now, and he has an immense personal fortune which he uses as he sees fit, and he loves track and field and he loves Hayward Field, so he chooses to spend his money there. But what Vin did took money and took resources, and I think sometimes he might have overpromised what he could deliver in a return, and I think that might have been most of the case with the 2016 World Indoor Championships, which Lanana landed for Portland at the Oregon Convention Center. You guys were there. And I thought they pulled it off really well, but I wasn't the guy count the bottom line. And I think those cost those World Championships cost a lot of money. And in the end, I think they were left with a big shortfall, much bigger than they had expected. And there's only one person that could make up for that, and that was Phil Knight. And I think he did. I mean, they paid their bills and all that, but I think that's when there maybe was a beginning of a little bit of a less enthusiastic support in Beaverton for Vin Lanana. So I think going forward, Phil Knight, as is evidenced by the fact he's built this palace of a track stadium, and Eugene still wants to invest in track, but I also think he wants somebody who's maybe going to be more realistic about what something's going to cost and what the return will be.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think some of the numbers, didn't line up like they thought they would, but then still needed to get the outdoor worlds at that point, right? So they still kind of probably had to work together, and they were still building this amazing new Hayward Field. So have you seen the new Hayward Field? How excited should we be? I'm under the assumption there will be track meets next year. I guess even if there aren't fans, the media will be there, but hopefully fans as well. But what can we look forward to, assuming you've seen it?
I'm not seeing the inside, only the outside. To my knowledge, the only people who have seen the inside are the University of Oregon track athletes, coaches, support people within the track program, and selected VIP alumni. I don't think anybody else has. If anybody else has, I don't know about it.
Wow.
I'm looking forward to going. I hope, pre-classic or Olympic trials. I guess NCAA's there next year as well. It's going to be...
Supposed to be. Now, big question. What do you guys think? I'm very suspicious that these meets are going to come off.
I'm kind of optimistic. I think it's going to happen. And I don't think there might not be fans, but I think the Olympics are going to happen because there's a lot of money involved there. And I think therefore the Olympic trials, I think the US will probably try to send a team. I think if you're going to send a team, they got to pick it. So I think they'll have a trials. We might not have fans there. NCAA's, I think, is going to happen because we've got a cross-country championship on the schedule. We've got an indoor championships on the schedule. I think maybe you see indoors get canceled, but I think outdoors, it's a little bit more easy to distance. I think that'll happen. Pre-Classic, I don't know about that. I guess it's not going to be that much. It's like end of May, and then the trials are middle of June. So if they have the trials, they'll probably have pre in some form. I'm cautiously optimistic. We might not have fans, but I do think we'll have a track season next year. Because we had it in Europe. And assuming the coronavirus, I don't know what it's going to look like 3 weeks from now, let alone 6 months from now. But assuming the US can get it under control a little bit, I think they can stage meets in the same way that we had meets in Europe this summer.
Yeah, maybe. I know the first time I took coronavirus seriously for what it could do to the sports seasons in America was when last March, when I believe the teams were already in Albuquerque for the NCAA Indoor Championships. There were conference basketball tournaments being played, and the Ivy League pulled the plug. It was the Ivy League, because I was following the track thing closer maybe than the basketball, but everybody at Oregon and within the Oregon team, in fact, I just done a feature on one of the Oregon athletes. They thought they were going to compete. They went there to compete, and even the 2 days before the meet thought they were going to compete. It was when the Ivy League pulled out that world changed. And didn't the Ivy League just cancel the winter sports?
They did. And yeah, I think, that's why I've been doing this feature this week about the NCAA indoor meet and the NCAA cross-country championships. They're scheduled for the same weekend. Are they going to happen? And I've talked to the Arkansas coaches, Chris Buckner and Lance Hardner. They're very much of the opinion we are going to have an SEC championships at the very minimum. And they're also hosting NCAAs. They're like, we're going to host it. We're moving forward. It's going to happen. But if you get conferences saying we're going to cancel indoor sports, and I think the Ivy League will not be will not be the last to make that announcement. At some point, you will have so many conferences have canceled that the NCAA indoors is going to be canceled. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get to that point. Yeah,
they're trying to play college football now, right? And it's just been a chaotic mess. The Pac-12 was the one that was supposedly had done it right. They waited till the very end. They got all their testing protocols lined up. They were going to test every day. It was going to be safe. They couldn't get through the first week. And if there's not a vaccine, and if that vaccine is not widely available, I don't know how you pull any of this stuff off.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And the Ivy League angle is interesting because, like you said, they were the first to cancel. They canceled their conference basketball tournament first. And I was livid. I actually wrote the Yale assistant athletic director only because I couldn't find the athletic director's email. And it's like, this is ridiculous. We're going to have an NCAA tournament next week. You guys, look, your Ivy Leagues, a lot of Ivy Leaguers think they're very smart. I'm like, if you guys know something more, I'm like, this isn't consistent. But if you know something more and we need to cancel everything, you need to get that out there. So I think they were ahead of the game.
So it was your fault, right? Because you wrote that, then Ivy League got it all out there.
Oh, I didn't think about that. I'm responsible for everything being canceled. So I think they were right there. But actually, I think for the fall sports, they were actually wrong because they canceled all fall sports. And it looks like now as we're getting later in the fall, maybe not. But I would say, we've had football up until now. It's the schools that are starting right now. If you're starting football right now, we're having more issues now, right? The cross-country season could pretty much almost be done right now. You could have had soccer. Most of the seasons would pretty much be done by November. They don't go that late in the season. So they blew the good window, and then they're like, oh, no, we're going to have indoor sports? And all along, I'm like, we're going to have indoor sports with the flu and COVID? Good luck on that one. So who knows what's going to happen indoors. But John, I'm pretty confident we'll have an Olympic trials. I'm pretty confident we'll have an Olympics. The fans and that stuff, I have no idea. Indoor track, no idea. I'm generally very optimistic about this stuff, but what that means during COVID is constantly shifting.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ken, it's been a pleasure recapping your career. Thanks for making time for us today. And, I'm glad to hear that you're hopefully going to be continuing in some respect, freelancing with the Oregonian. I think it would be great to have. You need to be at the Olympic trials and the World Championships in Eugene. It wouldn't be the same without Ken Go there. So
I appreciate that.
Hopefully we'll see you there, but appreciate the time today.
And I've stopped reading Let's Run, so I'm still going to be a fan.
Oh, I thought you said you stopped reading.
Yeah, wait,
No,
don't say you stopped.
No, I'm not. I have not stopped.
Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm refusing to commit to read the message boards, though. But I am going to read your front page.
Retirement, like what's on tap? I think before the show, you said you just got back from the coast, right? But like,
Yeah, it was beautiful.
what are you doing a week from today? I mean, or do you figure it out every day?
I subscribe to the New York Times, and one of the great pleasures is being able to sit and read it without thinking, God, I need to get going on work. And now I don't have that problem. I read the whole thing today. It was awesome. Before I'd skim here, skim there, but there'd be a bunch of stuff that I couldn't get to. Maybe I'll get tired of that after a while, but not so far.
That's great. More time to read the New York Times and more time to read Let'sRun.com. You heard it here.
That's right.
That's great.